Bill Hudenko, welcome to Build to Sell Radio.
Thank you.
How did you become such an experienced person in this area of mental health and entrepreneurship, and where these two kind of things collide?
Well, I guess the story of my mental health background is I'm actually was originally thinking about music and medicine when I was in college, but medicine, I found that chemistry was not my thing. And so I was adrift for a while thinking about what I wanted to do. And for me, music is still something I love, but it's not, it just didn't end up working out because of, I realized that it's not so much about how good you are, but rather who you know and other factors. So anyway, in college, I really became interested in sociology and philosophy and psychology. And as I took more and more classes, thought, this is really a field where I feel like I could have an impact and help people directly with the knowledge that I had obtained. So went to grad school, got my PhD, and I was really on track primarily to be an academic psychologist doing research. But I also had this strange background and interest in computer science. So ultimately what happened was about 2010 or so, I was thinking about the intersection between technology and mental health. And that was the point that foolishly I got into startups. And I say foolishly because...
Keep going.
Yeah, I just say foolishly because I knew nothing about business. I didn't know what a cap table was. I didn't understand growth, really nothing. And it turned out to be a really happy accident because since 2010 or so, I've been a repeat serial entrepreneur, and I've been able to leverage my expertise in psychology with the tech world to build and sell some companies. And it's been a wild and fun ride to kind of pursue what I love.
And it started with Incente, right? Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So my first company was about, I had recognized the limitations of traditional psychotherapy because the problem is we're with someone for an hour and then we're not exactly sure what happens for another week. And I wanted to find a way to kind of extend the power of psychotherapy throughout the week. And so what I recognize is that people actually spend most of their time with what we like to call their natural support network, which would be friends, family, other loved ones. So at that time, we built a platform called Proxy, where the idea was to get in the natural support network members to help them to sort of train them how to help someone who was depressed or whatnot, and to do it all digitally so that we could actually, all of those parties could communicate with the psychologist, assuming that the patient was okay with it.
Interesting. And how did you exit that business?
Yeah, so slowly, because I didn't really know much about business. I knew a lot about ideas and psychology and even technology. But it took about 5 years, which I guess wasn't too slow in the startup world. And we were at a point where we were thinking about, did we want to try to get more money and go with venture capital or do an acquisition? And there was a company out of Silicon Valley called First Opinion that was really doing primary care work with patients, and they wanted to pivot into mental health. So met with them through a VC. We kind of hit it off, and luckily it worked out to do an acquisition. So I came in as the chief science officer to that company.
And then you went and started Trust, I believe. Tell me about the idea of Trust.
Yeah. So, a little backstory before that was we changed the name of that company to Voy, and I helped them to sort of focus their energy in the behavioral health space on suicide. So we built a platform that was about using artificial intelligence to identify and prevent suicide. Long story short, over time, I was asked to become the CEO of that company. So I led that for a while. But meanwhile, I have an academic appointment at Dartmouth as a psychologist and a professor. And I was doing research on text-based psychotherapy. And at the time, this was now 2004 or 5 or so, a lot of companies had started doing text-based care, like Talkspace, for example, but it's kind of the Wild West. Like, it was unclear, does it even work? And how do you do it? So we got some money from NIH to do the first randomized controlled trial of text-based psychotherapy, was very skeptical about it as the kind of clinician lead in that study. But at the other end, it was amazing. I was just taken aback by what good results we had. And we were also sitting on the first kind of manualized treatment for text-based care that we developed through this study.
Sorry, Bill,
So
what is text-based care? I'm not familiar with that term.
Yeah. So in traditional psychotherapy, it's, you sit with a psychologist or some licensed therapist, you talk with them and have an exchange. And the active ingredient, quote unquote, of talk therapy is words mainly. It's how do we use words in order to help someone to change. But there are other aspects like facial expression and tone of voice and other things that happen in that interaction. So text-based psychotherapy is the idea that you're literally texting with your therapist instead of sitting in front of them. And it has major advantages.
Really?
Because for example, there's this high, what we call ecological validity, which means, imagine that you have a breakup with someone and it's the day after you had your session with your therapist. Well, you're sad and you're having all these thoughts about yourself. And by the time that you come to your therapist next week, your entire mindset is different. You've processed it. You can't remember exactly what you thought. But what happens with text-based therapy is you're crying on the toilet and you're texting us.
That's so cool.
Like we know exactly what you're thinking at the time. And it's so much more helpful to kind of walk you through and have much more frequent touch with someone than just, the traditional exchange in psychotherapy.
I find this so fascinating because I'm getting back into triathlon and I'm working with a coach and we use an app called Training Peaks. And every time I finish a workout, I have to type in a couple of words about how it went, right? Like how on a scale of 0 to 10, how'd you feel? Happy face, sad face, and then just qualitatively a couple of tech words. And I can't tell you how amazing this has been for me processing my training because I'm doing it in real time, just as you described. Because if I meet up with them 3 or 4 days later, I've forgotten how I felt at the time. But this is fascinating to me. I've never used your app, but I have done something similar and I can totally relate to that. So how did this become a company, this study?
Yeah. So what happened was, because we had such great results, I thought, this, and I was also an entrepreneur, at this point, I thought this is something that we could scale in a big way because we can see 2 to 4 times as many clients, and it solves some of the biggest problems of mental health around the cost and the scalability of any mental health solution. So my goal and my vision was to build the best text-based psychotherapy platform where that's the only thing that we did, and we were really the experts at it. So I just kind of started that company, I think in 2019. The timing was very good from a company perspective because COVID hit in 2020. And so everybody went remote with psychotherapy. So between kind of starting that company, then switching over to CEO from Voy, I think we sold it in about a year and a half because, we just got so much interest in what we were doing and other people wanted to use that tech.
Everyone listening to the show right now, Bill, is going, this prick doesn't even care about business. I've been slamming my head against the wall for 20 years and he rolls in some shrink and he's got it all figured out.
Yeah. Well, I do feel bad for any of those people who just heard that. What I will say is that, I think entrepreneurs know and hear time and time again that there is a massive aspect of luck and timing that often happens with companies. So I can't claim it was all total skill.
And did you make enough money on Enchente to live comfortably for the rest of your life? I mean, was this I'm asking the question because I'm a big believer in kind of Maslow, and the first exit needs to get you up that rung where you're not worried about food and shelter anymore. And you can start to think more about how the impact I want to have, purpose. Did Enchente get you onto that first rung?
No. In fact, Enchente was mainly an acqui-hire where it was primarily equity in. So it wasn't really until I exited trust that I was able to make other choices.
Yeah. And the choice you're now making, well, you continue to teach at Dartmouth and I believe you're still a clinical psychologist. And do you still see patients occasionally or?
Yeah, I don't really see patients anymore. Just because, with all the industry work that I do, there's not really as much time for me to do that anymore, even though I maintain my license and I love it. But it has been an interesting transition after this last exit, because I, like many founders, was adrift for a while thinking about what I want to do with my time now.
Sure.
And for me, it was never, I think, really a question of would I retire now, because I would get way too bored, and there's so many things that I have yet to do that I want to accomplish in mental health and otherwise. So for me, it kind of resulted in two paths. One is I started a company called Everpage, which is a real passion project for me around the idea of helping people to connect meaningfully. And then I also got involved in a lot of consulting, and I'm doing a lot of work with a company called Jiminy Health. And it's really a very nice extension of the work I was doing at Trust, where what happened is since that time, LLMs rose to prominence. And now, because of ChatGPT and these other tools, we're building something similar to Trust, where we're really completely changing the model of how amazing psychotherapy can be.
So fascinated to hear about that, and can imagine my mind is spinning on all the possibilities that entails. Well, let's talk about, and I kind of wanted to have that conversation up front because I wanted to make sure that our listeners understood that not only are you a professor, someone who is treated patients, but also you're an entrepreneur. You're one of us. So there's that instant credibility I think you have with our team here. And so with that as backdrop, maybe talk a little bit about in your own experience what you see are the main mental health challenges that entrepreneurs face that perhaps are unique to entrepreneurs.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things I think in general about the characteristics or personality of an entrepreneur is that we are not risk averse for the most part. So, to take the leap and to take the jump of like, I'm going to be in this secure job where I have a paycheck and I know what's going on, to like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to eat next month, is a big risk. And so I think a lot of us have this personality of like, I'm going to do this. I believe it. I'm going to take that leap. I'm willing to take risks. And of course, that is a wonderful thing and many times, but it also is associated with other characteristics where many times founders can be emotional. Sometimes they can have potential blind spots around optimism where they are sure everything is going to go well and it actually doesn't. And as a result, I think there's certain types of mental illness that are more likely in the founder population. And I think you set yourself up, if there is a failure, for a big fall. And as everybody knows who's listening to this, being an entrepreneur is extremely hard. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, it's the best way it was ever described to me, which I very much associate with, is it's like you're jumping out of an airplane and you're trying to construct a parachute before you hit the ground. And that's what it sometimes feels like in the early stages, without doubt.
You mentioned entrepreneurs are more likely to experience certain mental health challenges. What specifically are they statistically more likely to experience?
Well, it's a good question. Not using my professorial hat, because I don't know the actual statistics of that answer. But what I will say is I think that there's probably an increased incidence of depression and anxiety in particular in the population. And it's probably for twofold. One is that there's some characteristics of people that just make it more likely, as I mentioned, but also mental illness is often triggered by environmental factors like stress. And so when you have an extremely high amount of stress, when you have a failure, like my company has to shut down, and you've put all of your money and all of your time and all of your thought into something, when you're already predisposed to thinking I'm a failure, that can obviously trigger a depressive episode, for example.
Let me see if I can string this together with what you're saying. So there's something in the brain chemicals which makes entrepreneurs more inclined or more comfortable with risk taking. That same chemistry makes them potentially a slightly more bipolar, and I don't mean that in a clinical definition, but more likely to experience emotions both high and low. And as a result of that, and the environmental factors of just the stress of starting a company, they are more susceptible to things like depression, anxiety, and other things that would come with people who play on really far ends of each. It's funny. When I was first started interviewing entrepreneurs, I used to do this radio show called Today's Entrepreneur like 100 years ago. And there was this guy named Greg Clark who started a very successful company called College Pro Painting. And I asked him, like, what one thing do you wish you had known before you started? And this is sort of a very celebrated entrepreneur at the time. And he said, I wish someone had told me not to get so high on the highs and so low on the lows. And that was his main advice to me. And it's always stuck with me. And I think what you're saying is something similar in that we're just more susceptible both for chemistry, but also environmental factors.
Yeah, no, I think you captured it pretty well. It's a multifactorial thing, but certainly I think that there's both characteristics of the personality of people who are drawn to entrepreneurism, and then all the stressors that likely activate those predispositions.
Yeah. What about addiction?
Yeah, I mean, I think that too is, substance use disorders can run high as well. Now, one thing to say, of course, is in general, comorbidities where you'd have more than one mental health concern typically tend to be the rule, not the exception. So if, for example, you struggle with anxiety or you struggle with depression, very often someone might also have problems with alcohol or some other substances. And again, if you think about why that might be, part of it probably has to do with the person's natural tendency towards self-regulation. So if I have highs and super lows, I might be using stimulants or I might be using some type of depressant to kind of even out my mood, even though I'm not really consciously doing it, but I start doing it as a way to level myself out. Or it's a coping strategy. So it might be that you've learned to use alcohol when things are not going very well. And it's kind of a way that you just distract yourself or pull out from the stressors that you typically have. So again, I think that there's this combination of factors, but being an entrepreneur, certainly the stressful pieces of that increases the chance.
One of the things I find fascinating about entrepreneurship is the fact that oftentimes entrepreneurs can feel very trapped inside their company. And ironically, it's exactly the opposite of what they were aspiring to do, right? They didn't want to go to work for Procter & Gamble or General Motors because they wanted freedom. Yet when they get inside their company and they make commitments to clients and employees and customers and leases and, R&D contract, whatever it is, they can feel quite trapped by their business. And there's no easy switch to flip. Unlike when you work at Procter & Gamble and you hate your boss, you can simply resign and 2 weeks later you're free. You can feel quite trapped. I have found, I have a personal experience and certainly interviewed people who feel quite trapped by their business. And I would wonder from your perspective, what you would advise entrepreneurs to do who can't just leave. They're stuck in their company. And although they might be aspiring to one day make it so that it doesn't, depend on them, right now it deeply depends on them. And maybe they're medicating themselves to get through this challenging period. Maybe they're seeing a therapist or not. But what advice would you give them at that stage of their development?
That's a great question. I guess the thing I'd say more than anything is that your concept of being trapped is probably self-generated to some extent, as in that it's always a possibility that you could say, I need to find another CEO. I need to switch this to somebody else. There's some out for this. And that's part of where things get scary, I guess, from a mental health perspective is I just don't know the stats off the top of my head, but I think there's also increased suicide risk for founders as well. Because people do feel trapped and they feel like I've let people down or I'm in a situation that can't be overcome. And so it's a really sad outcome, I think, for a lot of folks. And I know I certainly personally, sort of empathize with this because for me, the very hardest part of the really rocky journey is the people involved. And you have all these responsibilities for employees, It's like, oh my gosh, I have to let someone go. And I love that person. I wish that I could keep them, but I can't. And so there's this, it pulls on your heartstrings all the time. So anyway, that was a very long way of saying, one is I would really evaluate and talk with other founders and think about, if you're really so unhappy and you can't see a way out, is there another way to do this? Is it to sell it lower than you thought? Is it take on a different role? Is it bring somebody new in? So I think there's more choices than you might imagine. And then the second thing I'd say is don't ever forget that mental health is like a gym. It's like in terms of physical health, we all recognize I can't just go to the gym once and expect that I'm going to be strong, right? I have to practice at it. And there's all sorts of aspects of mental health that you need to practice to maintain that equipoise that you need when leading a company. So and of course I'm happy to talk about some of that, but do what you need to do to maintain your mental health throughout your journey.
If you could prescribe one or two best practices to maintain your mental health for someone who just doesn't feel like they have the time to go sit with a therapist for an hour or to get in the car to go, like they're time starved, what one or two things could they do every day to protect their mental health?
Yeah. Well, that is one of the myths I think that we have around mental health is that like, oh, I have to take an hour and like journal or something.
Right.
And the fact is that it's actually sometimes the very smallest things that we do that have some of the biggest impacts. So for example, taking like 5 to 10 minutes to meditate or, ground yourself or do a breathing exercise can really potentially help with anxiety. Taking 5 minutes to make sure that you're connecting with other meaningful people in your life is really important. So, you're thinking, oh my gosh, I have all this stuff and I don't have any time. You probably have 5 minutes to text your best friend from high school and just say, hey, how you doing? Because that boost when they get back and they're like, oh my gosh, I just got a new dog and this is going on. You're like, oh, that's so great. I'm so glad to hear from you. The rest of your day is better because of that one little moment. So I guess my point in this is our brain often underestimates the impact of these smaller stimuli that actually are very meaningful to us and will help us. So take the little moments and plan those in your day.
Oh, it's great advice. Talk about exiting, because we've so far talked about running and building a business and the chaos that can entail. But I'd also be remiss not to ask you about the final stage, which is the exit. You've gone through it. So maybe we'll start there. What was it like for you personally to go through an exit from a mental health perspective?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is going through any exit, I think is sort of like, giving up your baby. So it's the process is hard because you realize that the biggest thing you're doing is losing control. It's like ultimately you won't be in charge of what happens with this thing that you've created. And that's hard because you've cared so much and you've put so much into it. And now who knows if it's going to be nourished and it's going to go really well or malnourished and it's not going to go well. So it's a hard transition, but also with the mindset of, okay, I think that something greater can come out of this, whether it's retirement or whether it's my next job or my next big thing, that there's a reason why you make that choice. Or maybe you feel like you just have to because you don't have a choice. But anyway, all that said, it's a very common thing where especially if you've exited and it's a sense of like, oh, I can retire now or I don't have to work anymore. That for many people, for most of their lives has been sort of the golden dream. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm now 40 and I don't have to do anything anymore. And I've always, work is okay, but I love playing music or whatever it is. So now finally I'll get to where I want to be. And once again, unfortunately, psychology tells us that is not the case. So I hate to break that to folks, but unfortunately, the best research on this that shows us kind of like what the truth is about this is probably from lottery winners, because there's been a lot of study for people who win the lottery and what does it do to their lives? Because they all of a sudden don't have to work anymore. And just like that, it's over. And sadly, they're actually not happier than most people, and oftentimes less happy than other people. So, all of that to say, why is it, and what do we actually do at the end? Well, the thing is that we actually know in the field of psychology, the factors that are linked with not happiness, but well-being. And that's the important distinction, because when we think about happiness is actually an ephemeral emotion. It's like, I ate a cookie and I'm happy right now, and that's wonderful. But what we're really seeking is not happiness, because that's fleeting. It will go away very quickly. What we all want in the world, not just, entrepreneurs, is to flourish and to actually have well-being. And there's basically 5 major factors that are associated with well-being that we can learn. And if you focus on those, even before you get to your exit point, you'll have a pathway, a trajectory that gets you there. So I'll just leave that as a cliffhanger. I won't tell anyone what they are.
You're not going to tell me what the 5 well-being are? Come on, give it up. What are the factors of well-being? I'm dying.
The show's over. Sorry. All right, fine. We'll go through it. So here's the way everybody can remember this. The 5 factors, it's an acronym called PERMA, PERMA, like permanent happiness or permanent well-being. P is positive emotion. And basically what this means is people who generally are flourishing their lives understand how to use positive emotion on a daily basis. What I mean by that is many of us think about the exit, quote unquote, or going to Disneyland. Like, that's the big thing we're focused on, our next vacation. And then we get there and we're like, Disneyland sucks. Why am I here? Or my exit, like, I thought this was going to be amazing, and now I don't feel as good as I thought I did. Well, it's because true positive emotion that really helps and works is in small bits, and that is the key. So that's why I mentioned already. You asked me about what I would recommend to people. Doing small things every day is actually much more potent than doing one big thing. So find a way during your day to put in little jolts of positive emotion. So in the morning, think about that perfect cup of coffee that you could make. Then think about that little text that you could send about to somebody. Then think about that little exercise routine that you love to do. You will have higher well-being than most other people, because you know how to utilize positive emotion. Next one is engagement. E. Engagement means people who have more flourishing typically have that experience where they get so engaged in something that it's like time stops and they don't even realize what has happened. So it doesn't, by the way, have to be your venture, but it can be music that you love playing, or it can be when you journal or write something or whatever it is, where it's not even a feeling of positive emotion so much while you're doing it, but afterwards you're like, oh, that was so good. I was just totally in it. That's what we call engagement in psychology, and we know it's linked with well-being. R is relationships. So relationships is, we know one of the strongest factors for well-being is having a small group of people with whom you have very meaningful, positive relationships. So you don't have to have a huge social network, but you have to feel like there's people in your life who you really connect with, who you really get recharged from. You really enjoy that, whether an introvert or an extrovert.
That's so interesting, especially for exiting founders, because a lot of times those people are people in their company. And when they leave, those relationships go away.
Yeah, exactly. So make sure you build them, even outside of your company, or that you maintain them after you leave, that sort of thing. Where was I? So M is meaningfulness. So this gets to the question of, what are you doing in the world that you think is important and meaningful? And again, going back to founders, many times founders, that's what they do that's meaningful, is their business, their company. So extract that meaning from them, and they are like, what's important now? What do I do? It must be golf. So, the key to this one is actually, usually the things that bring us the most meaning have social impact, meaning that we're doing something for someone else. And so whether that, your company was doing an amazing thing for somebody else and that gives you meaning, now it's like, think about volunteering. Think about doing something for other entrepreneurs. Think about, going to a school and helping out in the classroom. These things will usually bring you meaning and make you feel like what I'm doing with my time is important. And then the last thing is achievement, or A. So this one is the least strong of all the factors, but we generally know that people who are goal oriented and working towards something and actually achieving it typically have more well-being than people who don't. So you can go down rabbit holes with achievement and not actually have well-being because you're just goal. But, retiring and not having any goal orientation is a problem. So you want to figure out what it is that is your next big thing and kind of be oriented towards those steps.
So the acronym is PERMA: positive engagement, relationship, meaningfulness, and achievement. Mm-hmm. It's an easy acronym to remember and super helpful for our listeners for sure. How if you don't mind me asking, and if it's private, that's fine. But as you have exited your company, your most recent company, and now you are onto different things, Everpage and others, how are you getting PERMA in your life? Maybe describe how you're applying the same acronym to your own life.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do so because it is something that guides what I do absolutely every day. So the P, I absolutely build in things every single day to just maintain my mental health and have those little jolts that I love.
What is it for you?
Well, for me, a lot of it is relational. So I'm pretty good at communicating with a lot of people who I care about. And so that process is really filling for me. And then I have so many interests, whether that is I love to watch documentaries, or I love biking and I love hiking and I love playing sports. And so trying to get in as much as I can of those little things during the day fills me and really brings positive emotion. Engagement for me, I absolutely love playing music. That's something that never stopped from the time that I was young. And so to me, to sit down and even take 5 minutes to play the piano in the evening or play guitar, it's just complete engagement. And also I am a bit of a workaholic. So for me, actually, I'm lucky in the sense that when I work, I can really focus in and then feel good about that afterwards. Meaningfulness, for me, there's so many different parts of meaningfulness about what I do. At least there's certainly, family things that are very, very meaningful to me, but also even the career that I chose, I would never, not maybe never, but I don't think I would want to pursue a venture or something that wasn't meaningful to me. So whether that's teaching and the meaningfulness of that to me at Dartmouth, or whether it is the companies that I build, to me, it has to have meaning, it has to be important. And then achievement with all these things I just mentioned, I can't help it. I have a lot of goals.
Well, that's a great place for us to call it and put a pin in it. I'm super grateful for you taking the time. Congratulations on your exits, but more the impact that you're having, I think, on a lot of people's positive mental health. So I think it's amazing. People should all check out Everpage. Where else would you point people to if they wanted to connect with you, follow you? Are you a social media guy? Is there a place? Probably not, given the mental health impact. But what's the best way to kind of follow your work?
Yeah. I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm not very well represented in social media. That's a whole other episode we could have about my thoughts on mental health and technology and and social media. So I'm not easy to follow really outside of just, at Dartmouth. You can see my website. You could also, and I will update that as well as LinkedIn. And then, directly in terms of the mental health work I do, we at Jiminy, you can see, if anyone needs help, it's actually probably, I think, one of the best services on the planet, and it will only continue to be so. Right now, it's mainly just working with therapists in this new model, but so that's another way to at least see an expression of the work that I do too.
Awesome. And Jiminy, how is that spelt, and what's the website?
It's like Jiminy Cricket, jiminyhealth.com, and it is essentially a continuous care model where we have video sessions with people, but we also have text-based care from all the work that we've done, how to help people.
And we'll put Jiminy Health links in the show notes at builttosell.com. Bill, thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.